Welcome to the Get Invested podcast, where we share great conversations with experts from all walks of life to uncover their secret know-how and where they invest their time, their skills and their money, and the benefits that this has created. You see, the truth is that everyone invests. Every minute of every day, we're investing our time, our skills, our energy and our money in something. Some of us are investing consciously, some unconsciously, sometimes for good, sometimes for bad, and sometimes for no impact. Get Invested will help you to start living by design, not by default. I'm going to help you to make it happen, not let it happen. You will hear the top tips on how you can live with conscious intent so that you can live more, work less, and leave a living legacy by investing now. Listen to the show to discover the top tips on how to get started, make the most of your investment journey, and ultimately to be living your dream, not someone else's. More episodes can be found on iTunes or at bushymartin.com.au/get invested. Thanks for listening, and now let's get invested.
Hi, freedom fighters. Now, the beginning of the year is always a time when I like to reflect and think about the year ahead. So what's in store for 2022? And when it comes to property investing, everyone wants to know what's hot and what's not. Well, the year is now well underway, and if you've listened to my recent special Bush bonus odes, you'll have already got a very clear handle on how you want to live. And, of course, you'll have written down your 3 annual purpose goals, namely your personal goal, your professional goal, and most importantly, your passive goal. Now, the passive goal is the one that often gets left out or only vaguely considered. So, to help you decide and think about how, what, and where to invest this year, the next 4 special episodes in our Get Invested Summer Series will give you a range of views, predictions, and forecasts to consider from the country's leading independent property and finance industry experts that I've had the pleasure of interviewing recently in my anchor host role for Australia's longest running and most popular property show, Realty Talk. You can view these shows in entirety on realty.com.au, and while you're there, make sure you subscribe to Realty Talk, which you can hear and see on Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, Spotify, YouTube, or wherever you watch and listen. And make sure you sign up on the realty.com.au homepage to make sure you get every episode in your inbox every week. It's a really good show. I have a ball interviewing some absolute legends. Now, by considering this varied range of property predictions over the next few weeks, you're going to be able to make much better informed decisions based on answers to all of your key questions. Because this is going to help you to get a better grasp on what's in store for 2022, and it'll help you to appreciate what major conditions or initiatives are going to influence and drive the market in the days ahead. You'll know what are the risks and their impact on property values. You'll also glean what and where are the opportunities. Where should you invest for growth? And what actions do you need to take on the basis of the information, whether you're a buyer, a seller, investor, property owner, or a combination of all of these? The aim here is to help you to make very clear and comfortable decisions based on independent and impartial specialist information, instead of just continuing to rely on the fear-driven hysteria and misinformation that unfortunately continues to be peddled by the mainstream media. So this week, to kick things off, we're going to dig into some insights from 2 of Australia's leading lights, Effie Zahos and Terry Ryder. Effie is one of Australia's leading personal finance commentators with more than 2 decades of experience in consumer finance topics that include banking, finance and property. She's got a real knack for making money matters simple. Effie's best known for her role as the editor of Money magazine, which she helped establish way back in 1999, and she's now editor-at-large at CanStar, Australia's biggest comparison website. And of course, Terry Ryder, who's well known to us, is a leading property analyst and regular here on Get Invested as the founder of Hotspotting. Together, they've combined to co-author CanStar's recent Rising Stars report that you can read in full on CanStar's website. This week, Effie and Terry focus on the region's rising stars, given how well they did last year, while next week they're going to drill down into the capital city rising stars, and their insights are going to surprise you. So relax and enjoy this ear-opening chat with Effie Zahos and Terry Ryder. Greetings and welcome to this week's Realty Talk, the longest running and most popular property show in Australia. I'm Bushy Martin from Know How Property Finance, and we're breaking with tradition over the next few weeks to bring you a special series that share a range of views from property industry leaders on what the future holds for property across the country in the days ahead, so that you can make better, fully informed property decisions in 2022. To kick off our future forecast series, this week we start with part one of a two-part special feature that unpacks leading comparison website CanStar's recently released an inaugural Property Rising Stars report. And we're joined by the co-authors, Effie Zahos, CanStar's editor-at-large, along with Terry Ryder, the leading property analyst and founder of Hotspotting, to reveal the details and the opportunities. This week, we start with a focus on the regional rising stars, given the outperformance of regional areas since the advent of COVID. And next week, we're going to drill into the capital city projections. We've got a stack of surprising and very informative forecasts to unpack, so let's get on with the show.
Successful property investment is a game of finance. Do you have the right team and the right game plan? Realty Talk is brought to you by Know How Property. More than mortgage brokers, Bushy Martin and his team of investment architects set you up with a sustainable strategy structured to lower your costs, tax, risk and stress while increasing your capacity for growth. Know How has helped over 1,900 homeowners and investors secure more than $800 million in property wealth. So get set to live more, work less, and live your legacy. Want to know how to invest in your freedom? Visit knowhowproperty.com.au.
Greetings and welcome. Now, most of the reports published by property research organisations, unfortunately, are backward-looking. They tell you what happened in the past, focusing on past price growth, and it covers areas like the past month or maybe the past year. But real estate's constantly changing, and often the new trends that impact property markets across the nation are very difficult to decipher. So for this reason, leading comparison website CanStar has teamed up with highly respected research house Hotspotting to create a report that provides a glimpse of likely outcomes in the next year by examining a series of forward-looking indicators. The resulting Rising Stars report divides Australia into 14 major market jurisdictions, 6 state regional markets, and our 8 capital cities, and ranks these 14 markets on their prospects for growth in 2022. So to discuss the Rising Stars report in a two-part Realty Talk special that splits the 6 regions versus the 8 capital cities, we're joined by report authors Effie Zahos, the money expert and editor-at-large from CanStar, along with industry veteran Terry Ryder, leading property analyst and founder of Hotspotting. Welcome to Realty Talk, Effie and Terry.
Hey, Bushy. Hey, Terry.
Great to see you both.
Bushy, and thanks for calling me a veteran. That's fine.
Well, I'm right alongside you there, Terry. It's much more polite than saying old. So I'm hoping you'll excuse me for that because I'm exactly the same gambit.
Let's go with
experienced and mature and wise, I think, are the other terms that we like to use, Terry.
Sure.
But really appreciate you both coming on. It's a fantastic report, having read it from cover to cover now. So to sort of kick into it, Effie, can you sort of start by giving us a rundown on why you commissioned the report and what has been the approach and methodology that you've taken?
Yeah, we're extremely proud of this report. Hotspotting has done a brilliant job at the analysis and being, really the engine behind this. The idea really came about, I think someone like myself has been in the industry for so long and seeing what's happened over the past year or so. I mean, property has been pandemic-proof, hasn't it? Nobody really foresaw what was going to happen with property prices, and it's been crazy. So people's interest in property is at an all-time high. But putting that aside, and I think you hit the nail on the head right up in your introduction, what we're hoping to get out of here is a report that does have forward-looking indicators. It's not just grabbing for a headline. And I do want to make this clear that this is not the be-all and end-all. Research at the end of the day does end with you, the buyer. You need to have your own due diligence. But it's so hard to work out, where do I start looking for these properties? How do I start looking at? And the metrics that Terry has used here, there's a lot gone into that. So at the very least, this report does the hard work for you as to where to start looking. And so whether you're buying your first home, because that's one of the surprising elements of this, the range in prices, or you're upsizing, or you're downsizing, or you're buying maybe your first investment property, this report goes a long way to narrowing down those suburbs for you to look at. And what I do like is the way Terry's broken it up into, we wanted it very consumer friendly. So your 14 jurisdictions, as you spoke about, 8 capital cities, 6 regional areas, and then look at these 5 key metrics. What is it that makes prices go up? What's going to be a good buy? And so we looked at sales volumes, quarterly price growth, vacancy rates, rental growth, and the all-important one, infrastructure spending. Combine all that, then you've got 110 rising star suburbs that you can kind of sink your teeth in and have a look at closely.
Yeah, absolutely brilliant. So sort of put some context around this before we sort of drill into the details with Terry, Effie. What are the macro level drivers that you're seeing that are likely to influence property over the next 12 months?
Wow. Well, look, even like right now, as we're talking, you've got Australia's biggest bank coming out and saying now, okay, what we're going to see is property prices peak next year. And if you want to buy, 2023 is the year. Be interesting to see how these, that pans out. I think what's going to be driving property prices at the moment is, let's have a good look at what it's costing consumers to buy houses, because that's a big key driver. We know already the RBA's turned off the tap to cheap funding for the banks. And so that's why you're seeing all these fixed rates go up. But the big problem for consumers is that on the one hand, you're seeing, say, fixed rates go up, like a major bank like Westpac increasing their fixed rates 3 times in the last month. But then you've got other lenders, cheapest in the market, reducing their variable rates. I think the rock bottom price now is 1.77. Yeah. But what's going to happen here is that obviously, and this is good news, the economy is doing well. We're getting on track and coming out of this. And what that will see is that probably the inflationary pressures are going to move that interest rate cycle a little bit forward. And if that's the case, I think that's going to be enough here to kind of soften the market a little bit. And we've also got APRA jumping in with those, regulations.
Macro-prudentials. Yep.
Yeah, exactly. That's going to slow things down a little bit. So look, I think, prices themselves, will they hit rock bottom? Probably not, unfortunately. I think when you buy any asset class, it's not about time in the market, it's time in the market. And look, when you think about it, the median house price in Sydney is about 1.3 at the moment. Even if CBA gets that right and it's a 10% drop, you save about $133,000, but it's not cheap still. So this is why a report like this is very important to buy well, because so long as you buy well and you don't have to sell when things turn, a property does well over the long term.
Yeah, spot on. Yeah, beautifully said. So against that backdrop, and before we sort of drill into the nitty-gritties with Terry, what are your key headline findings of the Rising Stars report, Effie?
Like I said, I was pleasantly surprised to see the range of affordability in the suburbs that Terry has picked to keep your eye out on. That I like. That gets a big tick. And also the strength of the regional suburbs. We know over the past 12 months that, and I'm not sure, Terry, did you coin this word? Is that yours, the mass exodus? I'm not quite sure. You have to clear that up with me because I think you did. That rise of people moving out, because let's face it, once we were able to work wherever we wanted to work and that whole affordability pressure, moving out further became a lot more acceptable for a lot of people, and that drove some prices up too. So I was surprised to see that the top 3 spots were regional spots.
Yeah. Yeah, no, very interesting. Well, that's a perfect segue into perhaps giving us a rundown on the ranking of them. And I'll open the floor to either yourself, Effie, or Terry to give us a rundown in that battle between the 8 capital cities and the 6 regional areas. How have they ranked in terms of future capital growth from top to bottom?
Well, I was a little bit surprised at the rankings too. Not totally, but some of the locations that ranked a little bit higher than I expected, and some are much lower than I expected. But even though I was putting the report together, but we used 5 metrics that are all forward-looking because, as we've already discussed, most of what's provided to real estate consumers and media from the various research organisations is all backward-looking. And what we know to be true is that the past doesn't inform the future very often. Locations that perform very well in the last 5 years aren't necessarily going to be the leaders in price growth in the next 5. And those that have performed poorly in the past can turn out to be the hotspots of the future, because things change in real estate, things change in local economies. And therefore, locations such as the Sunshine Coast, for example, which 5 years ago I wouldn't have recommended because it was basically a tourist town, but a lot has changed in that economy through infrastructure spending being a big metric in that regard, and it's become one of the national leaders on price growth for the last 3 years. So those are the thought processes that have underscored the preparation of this report.
Terrific. So if we sort of go from top to bottom, just to sort of set the scene, and then we'll drill down into those in some detail. Can you sort of give us a run through on how those 14 jurisdictions ranked?
Yeah, well, ranking number 1 was regional New South Wales, and number 2 regional Queensland. And that didn't terribly surprise me because we know that one of the absolutely dominant trends that are driving real estate markets across the country is the one I call the exodus to affordable lifestyle. Yeah. And both those states are underpinned by strong economy, big infrastructure spending. All the metrics we used pointed us very strongly to those locations. Number 3 was a bit of a surprise, regional Western Australia, but again, similar rationale. The state economy of Western Australia has improved enormously with the rise of the resources sector again, but also very influential in the rise of Western Australian regional areas is the lifestyle areas, south of Perth in particular, beautiful lifestyle areas like Mandurah and Margaret Busselton. Yeah. So when you think of it in those terms, not necessarily a big surprise. Then Sydney came in number 4 as the leading capital city, and Canberra number 5. No great surprises there. Darwin number 6, and that may surprise some people, but the Northern Territory economy has improved a lot. Darwin's been in the doldrums since the big resources boom going back to 2012-13. Since that stopped, Darwin's been in the doldrums, but it's recovered very strongly in the past 12 or 18 months, and it's rising up the rankings. Perhaps what surprised me most of all was that Brisbane ranked only number 8, and we'll perhaps talk about that in a little bit more detail. I think if we do the report again in 6 months' time, Brisbane will rank higher.
But it's interesting, Terry, if I would just jump in, you had Brisbane as number 1 for infrastructure, and that's going to get even more exciting now with the Olympic Games. So, and that's the beauty about what Terry's done in their report as well, that for each of those, jurisdictions, there are the rankings within those 5 metrics that, readers can have a look at as well.
Yeah, brilliantly said. And as you well pointed out there, Effie, infrastructure is generally a very much forward-leading indicator that's not going to produce fruit in the next 12 months, but longer term will certainly have a major benefit on capital growth ahead of that curve. So, brilliant. Go on, Terry.
Yeah, and then also I think infrastructure is one of those factors that people like, the chief economist at Commonwealth Bank has been in the media this week forecasting what will happen in prices in 2023, but very much basing the whole situation on what's going to happen with interest rates. And I think that's very simplistic. I think there's so many other forces. This boom is not being driven by low interest rates. There's so many other factors driving it. And one of the ones that's yet to come, which I don't think they've really factored into their forecast, is the impact of the big infrastructure spend that's rolling out. And the other one they haven't considered is the opening of international borders and the influx of migrants back into Australia and the impact that'll have on markets like Melbourne and Sydney and elsewhere. So I think their forecast is going to be proven wrong again because they so often get it wrong. And they haven't really considered some of those factors that we've considered in this report. Currently, and this was another outcome that surprised me a little bit, regional Victoria and Melbourne ranked 10 and 11. And I would have, before I did the work, would have expected them to rank a little bit higher. But having considered it, they're really, I guess, a victim of their own success, and that they've been so strong for the last, say, 3 or 4 years, particularly regional Victoria. It has kind of led, I think, this exodus to affordable lifestyle trend and its impact on property markets. And it's already had a lot of growth. And so I think it's starting to slip down the rankings for those reasons. Yeah. But one of the things, I know you're going to ask this question later, but I think we get to number 14 and last, which is regional South Australia. And the reality at the moment is you can have a booming property market, and they do have booming property markets in regional South Australia. You can have booming property markets and come last. That's the sort of situation we're in with the national property boom in Australia at the moment.
Yeah, and that's a very good point. While regional South Australia might be last of the list in terms of where you're forecasting it to go in the next 12 months, that doesn't necessarily mean it's a bad result. It just means that the relative level of growth compared to others isn't quite as strong. So, very important to make that point there, Terry.
Yeah. Well, somewhere had to come last in this when we're ranking from 1 to 14. And it doesn't mean they have a weak property market in the current situation. Far from it.
Yeah, no, very good point. So if we start to focus on the regional areas as the focus of this first part special then, why do you think the regional areas are dominating the growth prospects over and above the exodus to affordable lifestyle that you've spoken about? And again, Effie and Terry, feel free to both jump in on this.
Yeah. Look, I think that exodus trend is hugely influential. I mean, I regard it as the most powerful force impacting property markets across Australia so far in the 21st century. It is enormously powerful. And it's important to understand that it's not a pandemic-driven thing. It's been underway for some time. Sydney's been losing population for 10 years to this trend, and Melbourne for the last 4 or 5. So it's about affordability and lifestyle, but it's about technology fundamentally. People's ability to work remotely is a big driver of it, and that's not going to change. Some people tend to think that once we get the pandemic under control, everyone's going to move back to the cities. I think that they underestimate the huge decisions people have made to make that. You don't move your whole life and family and livelihood willy-nilly, and you don't on a whim move back. These are long-term decisions that people have made, but the trends that are driving it are long-term. So I think that trend's going to continue, and it shows up in the outcomes of this report that the top 3 locations are regional markets.
Yeah, I think if we look at history, what happened after the Spanish flu back after the First World War, we saw exactly the same trend, and that lasted for decades. Because for the very reason you've mentioned, Terry, that the golden handcuffs in terms of the major changeover costs in moving from one location to another aren't something that you drop quickly and then revert. Yeah. And given the infrastructure and the technology support with the lifestyle drivers, I think this is definitely a hint of sustainable things to come.
Yeah, so, just the cost of moving house, the cost of selling a property and then buying a house in another location, you can easily tear up $50,000 to $100,000 with stamp duty and legal fees and agents' commissions, etc. It's not something that people do on a whim. So I think that we're not going to see a reversal of the trend. For that reason, and also the reason that the trend hasn't been caused by the pandemic in the first place. It's got longer term and more fundamental underlying factors.
Yeah, I think the COVID has just thrown petrol on the fire, really. So,
I mean, the obvious one too is just the affordability. When you look at the prices between regional and city, there's a huge gap. I mean, I know that has closed a lot, and I know, Terry, you've spoken quite a bit about the prices people have also been paying in regional areas, probably above and beyond, and not making the lives of locals too happy in that regard. But one of the obvious big benefit people could do it is because they could afford it in that regard because of the prices.
Yeah, very good call. Very good call. Well, let's drill down a bit now, Terry. I'd love to sort of break down and go through the rankings, but focusing on the regional areas only. So let's start with regional New South Wales. Why has this grabbed top spot, do you think?
I think the big trend we've just talked about, it's most evident in regional New South Wales. Sydney is the big city that's losing population the most to this trend. And, there are very, very appealing lifestyle markets very, very close to Sydney, like the Central Coast, like the Wollongong and Shoalhaven area, like heading west the Blue Mountains into places like Orange. These are wonderful areas with wonderful lifestyles, very affordable relative to Sydney, but very, very close to Sydney. So people can perhaps make that move and still be in touch with the capital city if they need to go there. So this has been a very, very powerful force driving the property markets across regional New South Wales. And now the trend has spread far and wide. So it's not just those areas close to Sydney that are rising, but places more distant, right down to Albury Wodonga at the border with Victoria, places like Wagga Wagga, out west locations like Dubbo. These are all really strong regional centres with very strong and growing local economies. And so
Sorry, Terry, the prices of that you're talking about, Dubbo and so on, in regional New South Wales, that's the bit that surprised me. Looking at, I think the lowest in that area was 290,000 for a regional house in New South Wales. Again, just showing that affordability, if you can relocate yourself there, of course.
Yeah, and that's absolutely right. And even the Central Coast, which is the market that's been perhaps the greatest beneficiary of this trend out of Sydney, there are 3 Central Coast locations that make our top 10 picks for regional New South Wales, and they're all places with median house prices in the 500,000s. Now, relative to Sydney, that's an incredible level of affordability. So people perhaps selling a home in Sydney for $1 to $2 million and be able to buy a home of comparable standard, and there's the sort of wonderful water-based environments that the Central Coast offers for less than half the price, perhaps. That's the kind of factor that's driving this trend.
Yeah, and that's really important too, because we've got to remember we're going to be borrowing responsibly as well. So if you're looking at a price there where, the median mortgage at the moment is about $575,000, I mean, there's no denying that when rates do move, they're probably going to move quite fast, because we've got to remember the rates are only low because of this pandemic. So once monetary policy tightens, that's going to move fast. So a 1% to 2% rate could happen quite fast. Can you imagine that on your repayments, if you're looking at a place where your mortgage is around $500,000, a 2% increase is going to change your repayments by about $600. So this is what buyers do need to factor in, that even though they are affordable, still factoring what a 2% rate hike may look like.
Yeah, perfect, and that's exactly the sort of forward planning and worst case scenario analysis that buyers need to be doing following this path. Terry, regional Queensland's ranked number 2. What's your read around why and what's driving the exercise there?
Yeah. Well, the biggest beneficiary of this trend overall is Queensland, of course, and the population data shows that the state making the greatest net gains from internal migration is Queensland. It's not all going to Brisbane, it's not all going to the Gold Coast and the Sunshine Coast. It's spreading far and wide. So Queensland benefits from that factor. I think the control of the pandemic is also a factor. People are escaping the big cities that have been most impacted by lockdowns, going to places like Brisbane and Queensland where they've had relatively few restrictions like that. There's also the lifestyle factor, the beaches, the climate, the affordability factor, the price comparison. Brisbane prices are half those of Sydney in rough terms. And also there's the infrastructure factor. There's a big infrastructure spend underway in Brisbane, but also out in regional Queensland as well. So all of that is in the mix, and it's driving big buying activity in places right throughout regional Queensland, right up in the far north. Places like Cairns and Townsville are benefiting. Smaller regional centres that many Australians would probably never consider, like Bundaberg. That's a huge growth market where, 12 months ago, you could buy typical houses in the 200,000s, not anymore. And Toowoomba, which is Australia's second biggest inland city after Canberra, and it's got this massive impact from transport infrastructure, which is still yet to be fully felt. But the inland rail link at the new airport there and the second range crossing put all that together, and suddenly Toowoomba's a player on an international scale. And we've seen Boeing, which has never in its entire history constructed aircraft outside of North America, has just announced that they're going to be creating major aeroplanes, and they build very big aeroplanes in Toowoomba of all places, because they've got the inland rail link and the new airport as infrastructure that makes it viable. So,
and you had diversity when you look at regional Queensland. You're mentioning Bundaberg East. I mean, jumping into there about 290k, and then you've got my old neck of the woods, Burleigh Waters, 985,000. So regional Queensland had a big price range. That's for sure.
Yeah, brilliant. So there's certainly some good buying opportunity in those up and coming areas. Let's move to regional WA, Terry. It's ranked third in growth prospects. What's driving activity over there?
Probably the biggest surprise to me in this report, but when you look at all the metrics, yeah, it makes a certain amount of sense. Firstly, the areas north of Perth, which are largely resources centres, but not totally, because Broome is also on our list. Broome is one of those lifestyle areas, wonderful lifestyle area, a wonderful tourist destination, but it's one of those beneficiaries of the exodus to affordable lifestyle trend. Huge uplift in sales activity there. Then you've got the resources-driven areas like Port Hedland and Carafa. We don't necessarily recommend that people invest in these places because they're very volatile and high risk, but they are rising at the moment. But fundamentally, the ranking of regional Western Australia is driven by those locations, those regional areas south of Perth. Firstly, Mandurah, which is almost an outer suburb of Perth, well connected by road and rail links, wonderful water environments, very affordable, and lots of lifestyle buyers heading there. Then you've got Bunbury, which is more of a workaday, second biggest city in Western Australia. It's got an export port. It's more of a commercial centre, but also got a wonderful lifestyle and very affordable. And heading further south, you then go to one of the wine areas like Margaret River, Busselton. You can see why people are wanting to buy there, driven by this trend, with the knowledge that you don't actually have to be in the big city to have a career. You can work remotely, and those are the sort of places that are being targeted right around Australia. So it does make sense when you consider all those factors.
Certainly does. The sustainability of WA generally, I'd love both of your comments on this, because there's a lot of commentators that question the fact that it's a bit of a one-trick pony that's very heavily reliant on what's happening in resources and the relationship with China. How sustainable do you think the ongoing growth in regional WA in particular is going to be?
Look, I think it is sustainable from, I mean, you're right that it is, it does have that element of volatility because its economy is so hooked into the resources sector, and that makes it a little bit vulnerable. And the Perth property market has tended to be a bit of a boom-bust market. But I think it's sustainable from the viewpoint that it's not just about places like China buying our resources. Australia itself is going to be needing Western Australian resources big time because of this infrastructure rollout. State and federal governments want Australia to have this infrastructure-led economic recovery, and they're fast-tracking everything that's anywhere near shovel-ready. And some of these are massive, massive projects, and we're going to be needing Western Australia's iron ore and other minerals just to support that. So I think, from that perspective, there's some sustainability to their current strength.
Yeah, brilliant. Okay, let's move on to regional Victoria, which is next on the list, but it actually drops down below all of the mainland capitals in 10th place. What's the story here, Terry?
Look, as I said earlier, I think it's a victim of its own success. It has been one of the national leaders on price growth. It got underway much earlier. One of the factors with this national property boom, it's essentially been happening for 12 months, but there are some parts of Australia that actually have been booming for the past 3 or 4 years for their own local reasons. And they include places like Geelong and Ballarat, and more recently Bendigo, the major cities of regional Victoria, which are within 1 to 2 hours of the capital city. And so that, they're great places in their own right, very strong local economies, but very affordable and attractive alternatives to Melbourne for people. So, but they've been on a growth path for longer, and so they're starting to perhaps taper off we've seen evidence in all sorts of metrics that some of those locations have passed their peak. So that's what's reflected in the ranking of these places a little bit down the list, further down the list than some people might have expected.
Yeah, okay. And I guess next on the list is regional Tasmania, which is probably suffering the same sort of impacts, having fallen from grace into the 12th spot. So anything additional happening there over and above what you've mentioned already, Terry?
Look, Tasmania has been fantastic, and Tasmania is a great case study to demonstrate what we believe to be fundamentally true, that property markets arise out of local economies, and what's happening in the local economy has a huge impact on what happens in property markets. Tasmania used to be the basket case of Australian economies. It always ranked last in CommSec's State of the State report. Now it's number one, and it's been rising up the ranking steadily for the last several years, and it's been number one for the past 5 quarters, I think, and that would surprise a lot of people. But it's been a result of very proactive action by the state government. Really, they obviously got sick of being the basket case. They wanted to change it, and they have. And coinciding with that has been the rise of the Hobart property market. It used to be the cheapest capital city in Australia. Now it's got houses that are way more expensive than Perth, Adelaide, and Darwin, and on a par with Brisbane. Now, that would shock and amaze a lot of people, but Hobart's no longer a cheap market. And regional Tasmania has been pulled along with that. So Launceston has risen massively, and so have some of the lifestyle towns, the coastal towns and the hill change towns of Tasmania, places many of us have never heard of, have had fantastic growth because they've offered affordability and lifestyle amidst a state economy which has been just going crazy. So, yeah.
Yeah, and no great surprise given that lifestyle exodus and that this sort of race to regional space, safety and security, which sort of goes along with that.
But in terms of its ranking, this report, similar to regional Victoria, has had 3 or 4 years of strong growth, so it's now starting to slip down the rankings because we believe that it's past its peak now.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah, go on, Effie.
I was basically saying much the same. The economy of Tasmania has really, Hobart has just really kept it afloat and has done extremely well. And even in some of those prices, some of the price growth that they've experienced over the year has been quite high. And one thing, I guess, also if I can bring back to the report too, is the good thing is that readers can actually see, okay, this is the median price, this is how it's been growing, and this is how much it would cost you to actually buy into that suburb. So they've got the upfront costs specific to that suburb, and then you get a good idea as well what a 20% deposit would be plus repayments on that. So a lot of people kind of forget that, you've got the deposit, but there's also these upfront costs. And if you're not a first-time buyer, you're not going to have a lot of exemptions. You're going to have to pay for those. So it gives a good idea of what you're up for completely.
Totally. You certainly need to be adding about 6%, depending on which state, and the stamp duty costs on top of the purchase price to fund, and the banks aren't letting you borrow that. So certainly need to factor that into the equation. We've covered regional South Australia already. So in sort of wrapping up the regional view, any final comments on future price growth for the region and areas moving forward that are worth sharing, Terry and Effie?
Well, I think that the trend that's driving it, we've talked about a lot today, is going to continue because it's a long-term trend. It's not fundamentally driven by the pandemic. It's all these other factors, technology, affordability, and lifestyle. And I think that will continue for the foreseeable future. And I think it's a great thing for Australia too, because we've had this drift to the big cities, and I think that's not necessarily great for the country or economically. But the fact that people are now moving to the regions and pumping up those economies, I think that's fantastic. And I think it's going to continue. And, affordability is going to be a driver, lifestyle as well.
Yeah, brilliant. Effie, sort of taking a step back from the nitty-gritties then, from your perspective, what are the implications for buyers, sellers and investors moving forward, and what should they and shouldn't they be doing now?
Look, unfortunately, affordability is a big issue when it comes to buying property. I mean, we all do need to have a roof over our head. For some of us, it's going to be easy. For others, it's not. And There's no real solution I'm seeing happening at the moment to address that affordability. Yes, there are cheap places that you can jump in to buy, but for me, it's always, my number one rule is just do your research. And this is why, whether it's this report or some other report, obviously get it from a reputable source, you really do need to do your due diligence, and don't just jump in because you fear that you have to jump in. Don't try and time the market. I said that at the beginning. I'm going to say it at the end as well, and do buy well. And then this is, some of these metrics that Terry has looked at, a goal in that regard. And they're the things you've got to look at when you're buying. At the end of the day, you want to make sure you buy well and not overpay for it. But look, if it's a long-term investment and you want to jump into it, then as long as you're bought well, hopefully you can ride it out.
Yeah, beautifully summarised. Well, you've given us some really great insights, and so I really want to thank you both for taking the time to share those with us today, and thanks again for your time on the show.
Thank you.
You're most welcome, Bushy. Yeah.
Okay, well, there you have it. So despite continued gloom and doom being perpetrated by the mainstream media, today's facts outweigh the fiction. So if you're looking to buy or sell property next year, make sure you have a read of CanStar's Rising Stars Property Report, which you can read in full at canstar.com.au/Rising Stars Report. It's a very insightful, forward-thinking report that gives you a number of must-read perspectives to help you make better informed property decisions. You're watching Realty Talk, your trusted voice for all things property.
Property depreciation is the natural wear and tear of a building and its assets. Property investors can claim depreciation as a tax deduction each financial year. Depreciation is a non-cash deduction. This means you don't need to spend any money in order to claim it. On average, BMT tax depreciation fined residential investors almost $9,000 in first full financial year deductions. Call BMT on 1300 728 726 today for an obligation-free quote.
Welcome back. Well, we hope you've enjoyed this first part of our Property Future Forecast special series. But before we wrap things up, let me summarise my key takeaways on next year's regional opportunities. As Effie and Terry reinforced, it's the regional property markets that are going to continue to be the ones to watch in 2022. Regional New South Wales ranks first overall, followed by regional Queensland and regional Western Australia, supporting the dominant exodus to affordable lifestyle trend, where residents of big capital cities are relocating to regional hubs. Interestingly, the lowest medium house price amongst the rising star suburbs in the top three regions is actually under $300,000, offering an affordable price tag for first-time buyers and investors alike. Rising star suburbs in the top regions include Blue Haven, Cessnock, Dubbo, Goulburn, Guanderland, Carrabar, Singleton Heights, Tolland, Toukley, and Warners Bay in top-ranked regional New South Wales. And in second-ranked regional Queensland, areas like Bundaberg East, Burleigh Waters, Centenary Heights, Dundarren Beach, Gympie, Little Mountain, Newton, Norman Gardens, Paradise Point and Southport are picked to be the top performers. And in third-ranked regional Western Australia, the areas of Broome, Carey Park, Falcon, Geograph and Halls Head are predicted to outperform. To get all of the details of the top predicted locations around the country, make sure you have a read of CanStar's Rising Stars Property Report, which you can find at canstar.com.au/Rising Stars Report. Well, that brings us to the end of this week's show. Another big thanks to our special guests, Effie Zahos and Terry Ryder, and a reminder that you can see all of our shows at realty.com.au. And while you're there, make sure you check out one of Australia's most extensive range of properties for sale from over 7,000 agents nationally. Thanks again to realty.com.au and BMT Tax Depreciation for their ongoing support. I'm Bushy Martin from Know How Property Finance, and I look forward to sharing part 2 of our Rising Stars feature, where we're going to drill into forecasts for the capital cities when I see you again next week. To get a summary of all this investment gold in the show notes, just email me on hello@khgroup.com.au. That's HELLO@khgroup.com.au. Or check us out at www.bushymartin.com.au
get invested. I look forward to joining you next week for another episode of the Get Invested podcast. So thanks for listening. And as always, dream as if you'll live forever and live as if you'll die